Brady hadn't been back to the city in nearly a year, not since the funeral. But Max had begged for pancakes on their short weekend trip, and he had said yes without thinking. Now he wished he hadn't. Not because the food was bad or the service was slow. It was the waitress, the woman who had just stepped out from behind the kitchen door. The woman Max had pointed to without hesitation, his voice flat with confusion. She looks like Mom. At first, Brady had dismissed it as a coincidence. Kids saw what they wanted to see. But then he looked, really looked, and for a full 10 seconds, he forgot how to breathe. It wasn't just the resemblance, it was like seeing a ghost dressed in black slacks and a name tag. He told himself it wasn't possible. Olivia had died in a car crash 2 years ago on a rainy highway in Colorado with nothing left behind but a wedding band and a pair of broken glasses. But there she was, or someone who could have been her twin, grabbing a tray of drinks and laughing at something the chef had said. It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. He hadn't come here to be haunted. The last time Brady had seen a face that familiar, he had been standing next to a closed casket. Now it stared back at him from across the restaurant, moving through tables like nothing in the world was wrong. For a moment, he considered getting up and leaving, taking Max by the hand and walking straight out to the parking lot. But Max was watching him, waiting. The kid had only said one sentence, but it had cracked something open in Brady's chest that hadn't fully healed. He waited. He watched. The waitress, Ruby, according to the tag, turned and caught his stare. She smiled. Not Olivia's smile. No, not exactly, but close. Close enough that Brady's stomach twisted into something tight and unforgiving. Max leaned over again. "Come on, Dad," he said. "She really looks like Mom." Brady didn't answer. Couldn't. All he could do was remember. The hospital, the smell of bleach, the silence of a room without monitors, the sound of soil hitting wood. He didn't need this today. He hadn't asked for it. But the woman wasn't going away. She was real, and she was walking toward them now, carrying 2 menus and a polite nod. And all Brady could think was, "How?" She asked if everything was okay. Her voice was low and kind. He had heard that voice before, in the kitchen during lazy Sundays, in the middle of the night when Max had fevers, on the other end of a phone call when Olivia had been stuck in traffic. This couldn't be happening, but it was. Brady asked her name. She said Ruby, and the way she said it made him question whether he'd misheard. But no, it was clear. Not Olivia. Ruby. Still, the resemblance was too sharp to ignore. He asked if they could talk. Ruby hesitated, but not long. She said she had a break coming up. Brady nodded, still unsure whether he was being foolish or desperate. Maybe both. He didn't know what he expected to find. Answers? Closure? A punchline to a joke he didn't know he was part of? Ruby disappeared behind the counter. Brady stared at the space she left behind, retracing every line of her face in his mind. It was Olivia. It wasn't Olivia. It was something worse. Someone who made him feel like the world had skipped a beat. Like time had folded in on itself and spat out a version of the past he hadn't been ready to see again. Max sipped his juice and waited like nothing unusual was happening. But he kept glancing at Brady, and Brady knew the kid saw everything. 10 minutes passed. Ruby returned without the apron, motioned toward the back. Brady followed, Max trailing close. They didn't speak until they stepped outside into the alley behind the restaurant. Ruby asked again if something was wrong. Brady apologized, told her she looked like someone he had loved. Not just loved, lost. Ruby didn't respond right away, just listened, and when she did speak, she said she'd never heard that before. No one had ever mistaken her for anyone else. She said she was an only child, that she had grown up in an orphanage in Cedar Rapids. Brady froze. That's where Olivia had grown up. She had spent her life wondering where she came from, always chasing the edges of some family that didn't exist. He asked Ruby when she was born. She told him, July 18th. Brady's mind went silent. That was Olivia's birthday. Not similar, not close. The exact same day, same year, same town, same orphanage. No overlap, no record, no clue they had ever crossed paths. Ruby looked back at him with the same eyes Olivia had, not metaphorically, literally. Brady couldn't speak. His thoughts were unraveling at the speed of light. If this was some coincidence, it was the cruelest one life had ever thrown his way. And if it wasn't, then Olivia had a sister, a twin, someone who had grown up on the other side of the same mystery and never known it. Max tugged on Brady's sleeve, asked if they could show Ruby a picture. Brady fumbled with his phone, scrolled, found one of Olivia from years ago, before marriage, before Max, before the accident. Ruby stared at it like it had just shattered the world in half. She said it looked like her, said it was her. Brady told her it wasn't. He told her that was Olivia. And for the first time since stepping foot inside that restaurant, Brady realized he might not be chasing ghosts after all. He might be standing face to face with the one piece of Olivia he never knew existed. And somehow, she'd been just around the corner this whole time. Ruby didn't know what to make of the man standing across from her. He looked like he was trying to solve a puzzle he'd been handed halfway through, with no picture on the box. She hadn't meant to start her break this way, with strangers telling her she looked like someone they lost. But there was something in the way he said the name Olivia. It didn't feel like flattery or confusion. It felt like something else entirely, something heavier. He asked again, carefully this time, where she'd grown up. She told him. A group home in Cedar Rapids, moved around a bit, nothing permanent, no adoption, no records of her parents. She never even got a birth certificate until she was 11. Just a copy of some hospital paperwork with her name and a date, July 18th, 1992. She'd always hated that about her story, how little of it she could call her own. No baby pictures, no family tree, no middle name. The other kids had people come visit on Sundays. Ruby just learned to be good at cards and keep quiet. Brady didn't say much after that. He just listened. He looked like he was trying not to believe her and trying even harder to believe her at the same time. He asked if she had ever tried to find out more. Ruby gave the usual answer. She had tried, a few times. Internet searches, letters, one call to the state agency that ended in a dead tone and a polite suggestion to focus on the present. But she hadn't expected anything. When you grow up without a past, you stop trying to imagine one. You build yourself from the things you can touch, a job, a place to sleep, a name badge. She never thought someone would look at her and see another life entirely. Brady was shaking his head now, not in disbelief, but in slow realization. He told her about Olivia, about how she'd spent her whole life wondering who she was missing, how she used to say it felt like part of her had been taken at birth and left somewhere out there, waiting, how she kept a small notebook filled with names she made up, sisters she imagined, mothers she'd never met, stories that sounded like fiction because that was all she had. Ruby didn't know what to say. None of it made sense. If it were true, if Olivia really had been her sister, how had they never found each other? How had they both grown up in the same system, in the same part of the state, and yet lived parallel lives that never once touched? Brady pulled out his phone again. This time he showed her a picture of Olivia holding a baby. It wasn't a posed photo, just a moment someone had caught during a birthday party. Olivia was smiling at the camera like she hadn't realized it was there. Ruby stared at it for a long time. It was like looking in a mirror that showed you someone else's memories. Brady asked the question that had been building in the air between them. Did she think they might be related? Ruby didn't answer right away. The question was too big, too heavy. She had spent her life being no one's daughter, no one's sister. She didn't know what it felt like to belong to anyone. But then Max piped up from the bench. He asked if that meant Ruby was his aunt. Said it like it was already true. Said it like it was the best idea he'd had all day. Ruby smiled at the kid. He was too young to understand how strange this was, how fast things were moving. Or maybe that was the point. Maybe kids didn't need proof to believe something good could be true. Brady looked at Ruby again, said he didn't want to push. But the coincidences, same birth date, same city, same system, same face, they couldn't be ignored. He said there was a way to know for sure, a DNA test. Ruby hesitated. The thought made her dizzy. What if they weren't related? What if all this hope, all this possibility, was just a trick of biology and wishful thinking? What if it all fell apart under a microscope? But she also knew what it felt like to wonder, to wake up and feel like a piece of you had wandered off in the night. She had stopped asking years ago, but that didn't mean she'd stopped feeling the hole. So she said yes, quietly. She said they could try, that it wouldn't hurt to know. Brady didn't press. He just nodded and said he'd arrange everything. Max clapped his hands, already celebrating. Ruby told herself not to feel anything yet. This was just a maybe, a what if, a lead on a story she didn't even know she'd been part of. They agreed to meet the next morning. When she got home later that night, Ruby didn't sleep. She lay on her couch and stared at the ceiling, trying to imagine what Olivia might have been like in real life. Not in photos or in other people's memories, but in the everyday. What she sounded like when she was annoyed. What kind of music she played in the car. Whether she laughed the same way Ruby did when something caught her off guard. She didn't let herself get carried away, but she also didn't stop herself from hoping. The next morning, just after 8, Brady and Max were waiting for her outside the restaurant. Brady handed her an envelope with the lab's name on it. Ruby tucked it into her bag without opening it. She didn't need to see the form to know this mattered. They didn't talk much on the drive. Max kept looking between them like he was already stitching together the pieces. Like this wasn't the start of something, but the middle of a story that had been waiting years to be told. And for the first time in her life, Ruby wondered if maybe, just maybe, she hadn't been as alone as she thought. The lab was colder than Ruby expected. Not the temperature, just the feeling. It reminded her of waiting rooms and paperwork she used to fill out when she was younger, hoping some social worker would tell her they'd found someone, anyone, who matched her file. But the calls never came. The answers never appeared. She learned to stop expecting them. Brady handled most of the talking. He handed over the referral, signed the release forms. Max waited quietly in the corner, his legs swinging over the side of the chair, asking no questions but watching everything. Ruby let the technician take the sample without comment. It was quick, sterile. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but it hadn't been how routine it all felt, like getting a flu shot or renewing your license. She thought something this big might feel like thunder. But instead, it was just swabs and silence. When they walked back out to the parking lot, the sun was high and the air had warmed, but none of it registered. Brady asked if she wanted to grab coffee. She said sure, more out of instinct than desire. She didn't want to go home, didn't want to sit in her apartment and stare at the walls, imagining possibilities she couldn't control. They found a quiet cafe nearby. It was the kind of place with chipped mugs and laminated menus. Ruby ordered something she didn't finish. Brady didn't eat at all. Max, unfazed by the weight of the morning, flipped through the menu like it was a comic book, asking if he could order a milkshake even though it was barely 9:30. Ruby watched him while Brady stepped outside to take a call. She didn't know what to make of the boy. He looked so much like the woman in the photo, Olivia. But he also reminded Ruby of herself in a way she couldn't name. Maybe it was how he leaned forward when he spoke, or the way his eyes scanned every detail like he was trying to understand something grown-ups weren't explaining. She hadn't expected to feel anything for this kid, but now she couldn't stop wondering, what if this really was her sister's son? What if the woman she never met had left behind not just a face, but a life? And what if Ruby had spent 32 years walking past it without ever realizing? Brady came back in, said the lab would call when the results were ready. No timeline. Could be a week, could be 2. Ruby nodded and said okay, as if it were no big deal. But it was. It felt like the ground had shifted, and now everything in her life was balanced on something she couldn't see. The next few days passed slowly. Ruby worked double shifts just to stay distracted. Every time her phone buzzed, she thought it might be the lab. It never was. She didn't tell anyone at work. She didn't know how to explain it without sounding like she'd lost her grip on reality. Brady sent a couple of texts. Max drew her a picture, 2 stick figures holding hands and the word aunt spelled phonetically at the top. She kept it in her locker at the diner and looked at it between tables. She found herself thinking about Olivia more than she wanted to admit, wondering what kind of sister she would have been. Would they have fought? Borrowed clothes? Would they have had inside jokes? Ruby tried to imagine being a teenager with someone else beside her. Someone who got it. Someone who wasn't temporary. The thought made her chest tight. On a Thursday evening, 4 days after the test, Ruby was stacking chairs when her phone lit up with Brady's name. She dropped the rag she'd been holding and answered before it could ring twice. He didn't say much, just that the results were in. He asked if she wanted to come by and look at them together. She said yes. She didn't ask what they said. She wanted to hear it in person, wanted it to feel real. 15 minutes later, Brady pulled up in front of the diner. Ruby got in. He was holding a white envelope in his lap, sealed, unmarked. Neither of them touched it at first. Brady asked if she wanted to read it or hear it. Ruby told him to tell her. She didn't trust her hands. He took a breath, said the test confirmed it. Check, they were sisters. The car went quiet after that. Ruby looked down, not at the envelope, but at her own reflection in the window. The word echoed in her head. Sister. A word she had never used for herself. A word that belonged to other people. Now it belonged to her, too. She asked him if he was sure. Brady said he was. The science didn't lie. Ruby didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just sat there, suspended in the moment between not knowing and knowing, between wishing and reality. She said she didn't understand how it was possible, how no one had connected the dots, how they'd both been through the same system, in the same state, around the same time, and no one had said a thing. Brady told her that Olivia had always believed someone was out there. She just hadn't known where to look. Or maybe she'd been looking the wrong way. Ruby said she'd never stopped wondering. She just stopped asking. After a while, it hurt too much to hope. Brady didn't try to comfort her. He just said what needed to be said, that she wasn't alone anymore. Max, sitting in the back, reached forward and tapped her shoulder, told her she was his aunt now, told her she had to stay with them. Ruby smiled. For the first time since the phone call, she let herself feel something. Not grief, not doubt, something else, belonging. She looked at Brady and said she wanted to see Olivia's things, her photos, her house, whatever was left. He nodded. They drove through the city, past neighborhoods Ruby had never really seen before, to a house she didn't know existed. But somehow, it already felt like part of her. The house was small, tucked into a neighborhood that didn't ask too many questions. Ruby didn't expect to feel anything when they pulled into the driveway, but something shifted the moment Brady parked the car. It wasn't familiarity. It was gravity. Like the place carried weight, like it remembered things she hadn't lived through. They didn't speak as they walked to the front door. Max ran ahead with a kind of casual excitement, like bringing someone home was something he did all the time. Brady unlocked the door and paused for just a second before pushing it open. Ruby stepped inside. She hadn't known what to imagine. A museum? A shrine? A cold, empty space packed into boxes? It was none of that. It looked like someone had lived here and left in a hurry, but planned to return. Everything was in place. Books on the shelf, blankets folded neatly, a coffee mug still sitting by the sink. Brady led her to the living room. There was a low cabinet near the TV, and from it, he pulled a large leather-bound album. No dust on the cover. This wasn't something forgotten. It had been opened, probably more than once in the last few years. He handed it to her and sat down, leaving space between them. Ruby held it in her lap without opening it right away. Max sat cross-legged on the floor, watching her, not saying a word for once. When she finally turned the first page, she saw Olivia smiling. In every photo, it was like looking into a mirror, one with different memories behind the eyes. Olivia as a child in denim overalls, Olivia in a graduation gown, Olivia at the beach, squinting at something just off camera. Then Olivia on her wedding day, standing next to Brady, bouquet in hand. And then Olivia holding a newborn, tired but glowing. Ruby kept flipping. The images changed. Holidays, birthday parties, messy kitchen mornings. Olivia with Max in her arms, then beside him, then chasing him across the lawn. The album told a story Ruby hadn't been part of, but somehow it still felt like hers. Brady didn't interrupt. He let her take her time. She paused at one photo in particular, Olivia sitting on a hospital bed, holding Max with Brady leaning over them. It wasn't a polished moment. It was real. Raw. Ruby felt something tighten in her chest, but she didn't name it. She looked up and asked Brady if Olivia had ever known, if she'd ever come close to finding out she had a sister. He said no. Not that he was aware of. Olivia had always talked about a missing piece, but the system had left no paper trail, no leads, no hints. Just gaps and silence. Max stood up and walked over to her. He pointed at a picture of Olivia at a park, sitting on a bench with her hands clasped. He told Ruby that his mom had always said someone was missing from their family. She never said who, just that she felt it. Ruby closed the album. She didn't want to cry, didn't want to fall into the kind of grief that didn't belong to her. But she also knew this wasn't grief. It was something else. It was discovery. It was the realization that the hole she had carried all her life had a name, a face, and a history. She turned to Brady and told him thank you for letting her in, for not closing the door when he easily could have. He nodded, said they were family now. That's what Olivia would have wanted. Ruby didn't argue. They spent the rest of the evening looking through more albums. Not just Olivia's life, but Brady's too. Vacations they took. Random Tuesday nights with takeout. Max's first lost tooth. Ruby sat through it all, letting each image build a story she had never expected to belong to. Later, when the sky darkened, Brady asked if she wanted to stay the night. Max was already curled up on the couch, halfway to sleep. Ruby thought about her apartment, the quiet, the cold, the missing. Then she looked around the living room again. She said yes. Brady didn't make a big deal of it, just pulled out some blankets and set up a place for her to sleep. Ruby didn't ask for anything more. She lay awake for a while, staring at the ceiling. The same ceiling Olivia must have stared at after long days, after heartbreaks, after triumphs. She wondered how many times they had both been awake at the same hour, in different places, thinking they were alone. Now they weren't. Not anymore. The morning came slowly. Ruby woke to the smell of breakfast and Max's voice humming something tuneless. Brady was in the kitchen, moving around like it was a normal Saturday. Ruby stood in the hallway, watching them, unsure if she should step in. Then Max looked up and called her name. Told her to sit, said he poured her orange juice. She did. Brady asked if she wanted to visit the cemetery later that day. Ruby nodded. After breakfast, they drove across town, past the places Olivia had lived, worked, laughed. They reached the cemetery around noon. Brady parked under a tree, and they walked together to a simple stone with Olivia's name etched cleanly across it. Ruby stood there for a while, reading the letters, the dates, the small inscription below that read, "Forever part of us." She whispered a quiet promise, to remember, to carry, to belong. Max took her hand. Brady stood beside her, and just like that, Ruby knew this was no longer a beginning. It was a continuation. They didn't speak much on the way back from the cemetery. Ruby stared out the window, watching the world blur past, trying to connect pieces of a puzzle that had never come with instructions. She had a sister. She had a sister. And that sister had lived a whole life just a few hours away, had loved deeply, had raised a son, and had left behind a space that Ruby now seemed to be stepping into without ever meaning to. Back at the house, Max darted inside ahead of them, announcing he was going to find something important. Ruby followed Brady to the kitchen, where he poured coffee without asking if she wanted any. She took it anyway. They stood in silence, the kind that didn't press too hard, until Max returned with a shoebox in his arms and placed it on the table with a grin that didn't ask permission. Inside were photos. Some Ruby had seen in the albums, others not. There were a few newspaper clippings, a wedding invitation, some postcards Olivia had written to Max from places nearby, even when she was only gone for a night. Small traditions that kept a child feeling close. Ruby picked one up. A picture of Olivia in front of a bookstore, holding a bag and smiling at something behind the camera. She asked if Olivia had liked books. Brady said yes, more than anyone he'd ever known. She had stacks of them everywhere. Fiction, memoirs, old travel guides. Even a few children's books she'd kept from her teaching days. He offered to show her Olivia's study, and Ruby nodded. The room was small, but it was unmistakably hers. Notes taped to the wall, a calendar still pinned to a date nearly 2 years ago, a bookshelf with worn spines and folded corners. Ruby reached for a thick journal on the desk. She opened it and found handwriting that looked strangely familiar, though she'd never seen it before. Olivia's. There were lists, names, places, moments Olivia wanted to remember. A page titled, "People I Might Be Related To," with no entries below. Another labeled, "Things I Know About Myself," with only 3 bullet points. I was born in July. I grew up in Cedar Rapids. I've always felt someone was missing. Ruby sat down without meaning to. She turned the pages slowly, finding fragments of someone she would never meet, yet someone who somehow knew her anyway. Olivia had drawn maps of imaginary family trees. She had written about dreams where she saw a face like hers but couldn't reach it. Brady stood behind her, not saying anything, just letting her read. When she closed the journal, he handed her another envelope, this one thinner, already opened. It was the lab results. She hadn't wanted to see them before, had trusted his word. But now she unfolded the paper and read it for herself. 99.98% probability. It didn't look dramatic on paper, just numbers and names. But the final sentence sealed it in clinical terms. Full biological siblings. She refolded the page and placed it back in the envelope. Max peeked in from the doorway and asked if that meant she was really staying with them. Ruby didn't answer right away. She looked at Brady. He gave a small nod. She said yes. That evening, Ruby helped make dinner. Nothing elaborate, just pasta and garlic bread. Brady told her which drawer had the spoons, where Olivia used to keep the spices, how Max liked his sauce without too much pepper. They moved around the kitchen like they'd done it before, even though they hadn't. After dinner, they played a board game Max pulled from the hallway closet. Ruby lost 3 rounds in a row and didn't care. The laughter came easily, not because it felt right, but because it didn't feel forced. Somewhere in the middle of the 4th round, Max looked up and asked what Olivia might have thought about all this. Ruby didn't have an answer. She didn't know what Olivia would have thought, but she hoped she would have been okay with it. With her being here, taking up space in her house, reading her journals, sharing her dinner table. She hoped Olivia would have welcomed her. Later, as they sat on the porch, Brady asked if Ruby ever thought about what might have happened if they'd met sooner. If she and Olivia had somehow crossed paths before any of this, before the accident, before the loss, before the gaps turned permanent. Ruby said yes. Of course she had. She thought about it constantly. She imagined them bumping into each other at a grocery store, working at the same summer camp, going to the same school without realizing it. She wondered if they had ever been in the same building, the same street, the same room. It was cruel, the way time worked. How close things could be without ever touching. But she also said this. Maybe they were never supposed to meet until now. Maybe this was when it had to happen. Maybe Max needed her now. Maybe Brady needed this connection more in grief than he ever would have in joy. Maybe she needed to learn how to show up after the ending, not during the middle. Brady didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The next morning, Ruby woke up early and sat with her coffee at the kitchen table, alone. The photo albums were still there, the journal closed beside them. She reached for a pen and pulled a notebook toward her. Not Olivia's, hers. She opened to a blank page and started to write. Not about herself, but about Olivia. About what she knew now. About what she had missed. About what she hoped to carry forward. When Max came downstairs and saw her writing, he asked if he could help. Ruby smiled and said yes. He sat beside her and started drawing a house with 3 stick figures out front. One was taller, one was medium-sized. One was little, with wild lines of hair and a crooked smile. Above the house, he wrote one word in all capital letters: family. The days started to blend, not in the way they had before, monotonous and forgettable, but with a strange rhythm Ruby hadn't felt in years. Breakfast became a quiet ritual, not rushed, not forced. She began to memorize the way Max liked his cereal barely touching the milk and how Brady always drank his coffee without sugar, but with just a pinch of cinnamon. Every afternoon, Max came home from school with more questions. Had Olivia liked math? Did she play soccer? What was her favorite holiday? Ruby answered when she could. When she couldn't, Brady filled in the blanks. And when neither of them knew, they guessed together, laughing at their own made-up memories. It was a game, but it was also healing. Each invented detail made Olivia feel closer, not further away. One night, after dinner, Max brought out the same photo album Ruby had spent hours flipping through. He opened to a page in the middle. Olivia in her 20s, sitting by a lake, a book open on her lap, eyes turned away from the camera. Max pointed to it and asked if Ruby thought Olivia ever imagined she wasn't alone. Ruby didn't answer right away. She traced the edge of the photo, letting her fingers pause over the date in the corner. 2008. The year she had left the group home for good. The year she stopped asking who her parents were, stopped hoping anyone was out there. The same year, Olivia got engaged. She looked at Max and said she didn't know if Olivia imagined it, but she hoped she had. Because Ruby had spent her whole life imagining someone was missing, and now she knew that feeling had never been one-sided. Later that week, Brady invited her to help go through the attic. There were boxes up there that Olivia had packed but never unpacked after the move. Ruby followed him up the narrow steps, both of them ducking under cobwebs and low beams. The boxes were labeled with old masking tape, some of the writing faded. One read clothes, another books. But one box, smaller, tucked behind the others, was marked in Olivia's handwriting, private. Brady hesitated, said he'd never opened it. He figured it was just journals or maybe old letters. But he offered it to Ruby. She took it carefully, peeled the tape back slowly. Inside were a few notebooks, a small wooden box, and a folded envelope addressed only with the word sister. No name, no stamp, no explanation. Ruby didn't move. She stared at the envelope, every sound around her fading into the background. Brady stepped closer, not saying anything. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink slightly smudged. Olivia had written it in 2015, 3 years before the accident. It wasn't a letter in the traditional sense. It was more like a release. A quiet confession from someone who had stopped believing she'd ever find what she was looking for. "If you're reading this," the letter said, "then I guess you found me. Or I found you somehow. I always thought I had a sister. I don't know why. No one ever told me. But I felt it. I still do. And maybe that feeling was enough to bring you here." Ruby folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. She didn't need to read more. It was enough. They brought the box down together. Ruby kept the envelope. That night, she sat on the porch with it in her lap, the stars above them invisible behind clouds, but still present. Brady joined her. He didn't ask what the letter said, just sat beside her, their silence filled with understanding. Max came out with a blanket, dropped it onto her shoulders, then climbed into Brady's lap. No words, no fanfare, just presence. Ruby asked Brady if Olivia had always been like that, hopeful in quiet ways. He said yes. She had hope even when she couldn't prove it. She believed in things no one else did. Sometimes it made her stubborn. Sometimes it made her kind. Ruby nodded. She understood now. The next day, Ruby made a call. She asked her manager for extended leave, said she needed time to figure some things out. He didn't argue. She'd never taken more than a weekend off. When she hung up, she told Brady she was staying. For now. Not forever. Not yet. But for now. Brady didn't push. He just said he was glad. That afternoon, they sat together and started scanning the old photographs into digital folders. Max helped label them with categories like beach trip and weird faces. They found photos Olivia had taken but never printed. Pictures of plants, street corners, random strangers she must have found interesting. Max joked she would have been a great spy. Ruby said she already had been, spying on a sister she hadn't met yet. On Sunday, Ruby opened her own storage bin from the apartment and found the 3 photos she had from childhood, all grainy, all faded. One was of her in a hospital crib. The other 2 were school pictures from the group home. She showed them to Max, who immediately pointed out the same nose, the same ears, the same weird bend in the eyebrow Olivia had always tried to pluck straight. Ruby laughed, then stopped, then laughed again. That night, as she lay in the guest room with the letter on the nightstand and the photo album beside the bed, she thought about the moment the test results came in. How her hands had shaken, how she hadn't known if she wanted them to confirm or deny. Now she couldn't imagine them saying anything else. She closed her eyes and whispered the word again, not like a question, but like a name she'd always known. Sister. Ruby woke before sunrise. The house was still. The usual creaks and shifting pipes were quiet, as if even the walls were resting. She lay there for a moment, the room faintly lit by the street lamp outside, and listened to nothing. Then she got up, picked up the letter Olivia had written years before, and walked down the hall. The kitchen lights were dim. She made coffee without needing to check where anything was. By now, the placement of mugs and filters felt like second nature. When Brady stepped in, hair slightly tousled, he looked at her, nodded, and poured a second cup. No small talk. No need. Max wandered in soon after, dragging a blanket and announcing he was hungry. Ruby made eggs. Brady buttered toast. It was the kind of ordinary that somehow made all the extraordinary from the past week even more meaningful. The quiet wasn't emptiness. It was peace. Later that morning, Ruby asked if they could visit Olivia's house one more time. Brady hesitated, then nodded. It was still theirs, technically. He hadn't had the heart to sell it or rent it out. He kept it cleaned, kept the utilities running, though no one had lived there in almost 2 years. They drove in silence. Max fell asleep in the back seat, head tilted against the window. When they pulled into the driveway, Ruby felt something shift again. But this time it wasn't gravity. It was presence. Brady unlocked the door and stepped aside, letting her enter first. Ruby walked through the room slowly, not touching much, just absorbing. The furniture had been covered in sheets, but everything else remained the same. Olivia's books were still alphabetized. Her coat still hung by the door. Her handwriting still marked the calendar on the fridge, February 13th, Max's school recital. Ruby paused in the bedroom. There was a small vanity near the window, lined with perfume bottles and an old jewelry box. She opened it carefully. Inside were trinkets, earrings, pins, a locket. She opened the locket. A photo of Max on one side, a blank spot on the other. As if it had waited, she placed the locket in her pocket just for now. Then moved to the dresser, where a small album had been tucked away beneath folded scarves. It wasn't like the others. This one was handmade. Photos taped in, scribbled notes in the margins. A page marked with a single word, maybe. On that page, Ruby found a picture of Olivia as a teenager, standing in front of the group home. Ruby had never seen the photo, but she recognized the spot. She had stood in that same place for her own yearbook shot just 1 year later. They had been there, together, at least once, just not knowing it. She turned to Brady and told him. He blinked, stunned. Asked if she was sure. She nodded. The timeline matched. They must have been there within months of each other. Maybe even crossed paths in the hallway, sat at the same lunch table, passed each other in silence. Max, now awake and exploring the house, came into the room with an old album of drawings. His mom's childhood sketches, faces, animals, doodles in the margins of math worksheets. He held it like it was fragile. Ruby took it from him gently and flipped through. She recognized a sketch halfway in. It was a girl with short hair and a missing tooth, drawn from memory. The caption read, "She sat 2 tables over, never smiled." Ruby sat on the edge of the bed, breath catching in her throat. It was her, not imagined, not symbolic. Olivia had drawn her, seen her, remembered her. And yet, neither of them had ever known the connection that had tied them together even back then. Brady sat beside her. Neither of them spoke. They stayed at the house for the rest of the afternoon. Ruby took photos of a few keepsakes, carefully packed a few things into a small box. She didn't want to empty the place, just bring some of it home. Back at Brady's, Max asked if Ruby would stay again. This time, she didn't hesitate. She said yes. The next few weeks unfolded like a quiet restoration. Ruby filed for a leave of absence, then later put in notice at the diner. She didn't need to go back. Something in her had shifted, not because of geography, but because of truth. She wasn't trying to run from the past anymore. She was walking towards something new, built on everything that had once been missing. One evening, Brady found her in the garage sorting through Olivia's donation boxes. She told him she wanted to start something, a reading group, maybe a scholarship, maybe just a bookshelf at the community center in Olivia's name. Something small but lasting. He said it sounded right, and it did. Max drew another picture. This one had 4 stick figures. He handed it to Ruby and pointed, "That one's you, that one's me, that's Dad. And that," he said, pointing to a glowing shape in the corner, "that's Mom watching us." Ruby pinned it to the fridge. On the 1-year anniversary of the day they met, Brady, Ruby, and Max returned to the cemetery. They didn't bring flowers, just each other. Ruby read the letter Olivia had written aloud, her voice steady. Max held her hand. Brady stood beside them, silent. They stayed a while, watched the wind move through the grass, then turned to go. Ruby looked back once, not in mourning but in recognition. She had come here a stranger. Now she was leaving as a sister, an aunt, and something more, a piece of a story that had waited patiently to be told. She understood now that some lives run parallel, just close enough to feel but not touch, until something pulls them together. Loss, memory, a child's voice in a diner. And when they meet, those lives don't just overlap. They change course. They build bridges. They fill silence. Sometimes family isn't who you begin with. Sometimes it's who finds you when you think you've been forgotten. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to today's story. We're truly grateful for your presence and your attention. This story is more than just a series of events. It's a reminder that sometimes the family we're meant to find comes into our lives in the most unexpected ways. No matter how much time has passed or how far apart we've been, connection has a way of finding its path. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us in the telling. If you'd like to support our channel, all it takes is a simple click on the like button. It helps us continue bringing meaningful stories like this to life. We'd also love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below telling us which country you're watching from and how the story resonated with you. And if you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you'll never miss a new story. Your engagement means everything to us, and it keeps this community growing around heartfelt, unforgettable narratives. Thank you again for being here.